here, and we're going to have another chat about ELFH topics. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that reporting. How do we present our findings? And so hopefully what I will go through will give you an idea of what are the components that you need to share your findings. So let's get started. So how to present the findings, and talking a little bit about the detailed summary. If you think about it right now, you have gone through quite a few pieces of the engagement trying to find information. And so if you think about our process where we have been, the plan and instrumentation, and that's the first section. When I ask you to consider of a project and what you were going to do with it, what is your needs analysis? What are you going to go after? What is the gap? What is the current state? What is the future state, etc.? So in that plan and instrumentation, you're going to definitely explain the reasoning, describe the methodology, and then display the instrumentation. So that's the second part that you have done up to this point. Beyond that, you have to describe your results, and this is where you get into that part 3 of sorts, right? Once you have talked about interviews, using focus groups, using observations, data retrievals, etc., you have gathered that information, you have sent the surveys, you have got reports back, and you are now having all these data. Potentially you have done statistical analysis, or you have done just the basic central tendency measures, and you have probably found your aha moments, your observations perhaps on things that you didn't know people did, or people did consult in terms of a process, right? So now you're going to describe what you found. So in that description, you're going to list both the qualitative and the quantitative results, making sure that you explain what is it that you found. Because remember, at this point, you have been so engrossed into the entire process that you know it. And so you don't think about explaining what you found to your reader. So make sure you list exactly what your findings have been, but give context. What you found as a result of what hunch that you had, or what perspective, or what piece of information did your client give you that made you think, I need to look at this to find out what is really happening. So once you've done that, then you can also visually tell the reader what is it that you found. Use tables, use charts, depending on what you need. Sometimes a good trend is going to be visually displayed, so you can see either over time, over cycles, or over processes where the increase or decrease or the gap is being created. After that, after describing those results, we need to definitely summarize those key points. That's where your analysis has taken place, and now you decide to bring those 2 or 3 things to your client. So the client, remember, the client engaged you to help them find the gap, or perhaps validate the gap. And maybe they didn't say it that way. Maybe they came to you saying, we need a solution for X. But before you prescribe a solution or validate a solution, remember that the whole purpose of a needs analysis is to validate that need. Do we really have a gap? Do we need to fill it? So once you have done the data collection, once you have analyzed the data, then you need to summarize those key points, what your findings were. Usually, style-wise, it'll vary depending on the company that you are with. Think about the culture of that company. Do they like to see things in a bulleted list? Do they like to see things in index cards? Do they like to see things in slides, etc.? But for the purpose of our course, we're definitely going to do those key points in the APA style within a piece of paper or within a paper, right? So make sure you keep that in mind. You can use bulleted lists for the important factors, but you also need to talk about the topics or areas of relevance, and then the information that may help the client. You can do that in a form of narrative as a regular paragraph, but one of my pieces of advice, introduce the section in a narrative format, meaning a paragraph, but then dive into bullet points, get into lists, or at least into sections. That way, it's a lot easier for the reader to follow through your narrative of this summarizing points. Once you have done that, then you can move to creating an executive summary. Now, some of you may ask, where did this come from? Okay, so let me just say, for the purpose of our HAT or homework assessment, I am not asking you to create an executive summary, but instead use the same components of what we would use in an executive summary as part of your final wrap-up of the paper. Okay, that's for that class. In reality though, when you are working with a company, you will have your full report that somebody will definitely ask you for, but if you're meeting with your client, which usually is going to be somebody in a director position or in a vice president position, etc., they don't have time. And so they like everything very, very quick, very, very fluid. And so that's why we call it an executive summary. So we will talk a little bit about what exactly an executive summary looks like. And the length will really depend. In this case, the needs analysis, we definitely want a beginning, a middle, and an end. As ironic as that may sound, but the reality of it is we want to make it very concise, but at the same time, very purposeful. So keep in mind the lists of the beginning factors, what is the purpose of the needs analysis, what we were going after, and then what to consider and what to do. So that's essentially what you're going to put in the executive summary. So let's dive in. As far as the plan and the instruments, which is the part 2, and at this point you all should have experienced that. So let me put it into context. The first part, which is what you did at the beginning of the semester, the memorandum of agreement is what many of you will remember. That, in reality, again, is almost like a contract, if you will. When you're talking to your client, you're saying, this is what I'm going to do. This is what you're asking me to look after. And here's my overall question. And this is the framework. What it is today, what you want it to be in the future, or the desired state, and then what we believe the gap may be. This can come from your client, or is something that you perhaps discovered through a meeting with your client. And then, of course, that memorandum of agreement is that contract that says this is what I'm going to do over this period of time, and these are the pieces or the axes of information that I will need. Then you move into the second part, which is the instrumentation. That's when we start talking about the methodology for collecting data. Now remember, you can sit there and think about reasons why something happened all day long, but the reality of it is this course helps us understand that people can guess something, but the reality is that there is a situation behind it that makes it happen, or there is a causality, and so we need to find that causality. So just because somebody feels like a process is not being followed doesn't mean it really isn't being followed. We sometimes need to evaluate, we need to observe, etc. So in that second part, you went ahead and described the data that you were going to need for your gap and for your needs analysis. You were going to list the methodologies, whether it was an interview, a focus group, a data retrieval, etc., and also show what that instrument is going to look like. So in the case of a survey, of course, you list the instrument itself, whether it's 10 questions, 5 questions, 15 questions, but you were going to have that in an appendix. If you were going to do an interview or a focus group, similarly, in an appendix, you would have the questions that you would ask in the interview or during the focus group. And of course, you would explain the setup of such. Where is it going to be? Are you going to invite people, etc.? Are you going to have a scribe and all of that? So you have those two parts, right? So now we're going to add the third part. So we went through the first part, which is very much setting up the whole engagement. The second part, which talks about, oh, here's the data we need and here's how we're going to collect it. Now we're getting into that third part, which is the reporting. So in that reporting, we're going to summarize the findings and the conclusions that we have found. Be careful, because the language, or the tone rather, we are going to use for write-up of the third part shouldn't be prescriptive. I say is, but really should not be prescriptive. And so in that section, you're going to describe results of the qualitative and the quantitative data that you have. You also are going to list the key information, and you can use graphics, you can use charts, you can use both, a graphic and then an interpretation of what you see on the graph, or a chart and an interpretation of what you see on that chart. What are those things to look at? And then, of course, present your recommendations based on those findings. Keep in mind that just because a client called you as a consultant to come over and do a needs analysis does not mean we have to do something. Your entire purpose is precisely to validate the gap and to help the client realize whether they need to do something about it or not. In some cases, they may not need to do anything. Remember what I have said in other situations. Just because there is a gap, the cost that it may take to fill that gap may be greater than letting it exist. So there are companies that may see a gap, but because it's going to be too expensive to fill that gap, they just keep it. And some companies do decide to do that because it's not worth the investment for what they are going to recover, or they are already spending money in a certain way by not following a certain process, and so it's not worth fixing it. And so you have to keep in mind that too. So once you have done that, then you get into building your executive summary, which again, for us, for the purpose of this class, it simply will be the way you write up your conclusion, your closing of the paper. In reality, in a company, executive summary definitely does look almost like a one-pager or like a slide deck with two slides, something brief that you can verbally speak to the client. And so talking about the temperature or the tonality of your message. So I have divided it into two. Imagine that you have to write a report, which in this course, that is the case. So in the narrative, you're going to add the purpose and the goal. What are the questions, or what is the main question, the overall question to answer? What process you used to answer that question? And then your findings, right? So we've been talking about that. Categories, bullets, overarching themes, etc. Anything that is helpful. And then once you have done that, your recommendations. What will be good for the company based on your findings? And remember, the bottom line is usually at stake here. So if it's too expensive to fix, you may not want to recommend for anything to be done because it's more expensive. But that you don't necessarily know. Although you would have a good sense because you have been observing and poking into the company. So you may have an idea, and that's part of what they are looking for you at. Just because you recommend something doesn't necessarily mean the client won't do it. They may still do it, and that's what you have to keep in mind. But they want your professional opinion based on data, and that's exactly the tonality we should use. And then, of course, in the write-up, your next steps, which at the end of the engagement of the needs analysis, that's where your work ends. At that point, you say, this is what could be done, and then you decide whether you can offer the services for those next steps or not. If, for example, it were training what was needed for filling the gap, and you were able to design training, then you could offer that as a separate service. If you wanted process rework, and you were a good process person, then you could offer that as a service. But that is a complete separate engagement than the needs analysis. Now, some people, in this class we didn't have to do that, but in some cases you do have to do a verbal report. So once you have turned in your paper, then in the verbal reporting you could summarize the findings and tie them to the gap. You could also list trends or elements that are relevant to the gap. And when you deem it necessary, you can highlight those things that were not clear or could not be tested during your entire engagement. The reason why I'm suggesting to do that verbally is because sometimes the narrative needs to be very tight. And in many cases, unless it is extremely necessary to call that out, you wouldn't necessarily need to say, well, I couldn't really observe this for XYZ reason, so I still have doubts on it. If it doesn't really help you provide a response, then it really is not that relevant. However, if you weren't able to conclude something because of the lack of access, that is important to put in your actual written report. So keep that in mind. Now, talking about graphics to represent your findings, they're powerful. Graphics are powerful because depending on how you put them up, remember that people are visual and others are more contextual. So there are some people that are going to like to read, and there are some people that are going to like to see. So the graphics definitely set up a good stage where you can figure out introduction of these are the things that I'm going to talk about, like statistics, and then this is what I interpret on those statistics. So if you look at the screen right now, definitely use those to highlight comparisons, trends, implications, factors, relevant items that may be worth exploring in the future, and things perhaps that were not even accounted for at your beginning session. In addition to that, you can then use other graphics. So here I have a couple of examples. So let me go through one. This one is a complete random example of some training that some organization is using. And by looking at the numbers, not that I am going to analyze the actual numbers, but notice how you are seeing two different bulks of data. On the right side, you are seeing a graphical representation of things. So the things that are very much used are at the bottom with 447, 438, 373. Things that are very seldom used are like the first and second items with 18 hits or 21 hits. So that does paint a very big picture. If you want to pay attention to something, you want to look at the bigger numbers, right? On the left side of the screen, you see the difference. So over time, for example, the second number, plus 55%. So that is a positive number in relation to the previous month. Well, in your case, this is more of a dashboard type of report. But in your case, what you're doing is you are telling the story in terms of what you found. So usually it's historical. People used to do this and now this is happening. So there's a difference. So this graph could help you do that. If that doesn't help, here's another example. So in this one, also talking about training, notice, for example, the relevance of in-person versus virtual. They both happened at 87% and 89%, but if you notice the numbers below that are very relevant. In person is more impactful than virtually. So you can also make those comparisons. They do not have to be your standard bars or pie charts, etc. They can be as creative as that. So something to think about. And here's another example. This, for example, talks about money. So the cost of learning in over time. So you look from January through July. If you look at the bottom graph, it does give a good context of trends. So that's important. The top graph gives you a comparison with the bars. So you have to choose what graphic is going to give you the best outlook for the data that you are presenting. And this is important to use on the section 3 of your report. Now, I showed you quite a few examples. That does not mean you have to add every single one of them to your project. Only use those that are pertinent to the data that you found. But definitely give graphics or charts or data like this that paints a picture. Don't do it just because you want to make it look pretty. That doesn't help. So let's talk about tools now. And I have a couple of tools. 4 blockers, which is something probably you haven't heard about, and executive summaries. So what they look like, by the way, these tools do not necessarily need to be a part of your hallmark assessment or HAT. I am just giving those to you so you know what else you could use to present your findings. So the 4 blockers is more of a project engagement report. Here's an example of emotional intelligence, something that is a soft skill. It's considered training. It's helping fill a gap. It can be a gap on anything, right? It can be a gap on interactions, it can be a gap on empathy, whatever emotional intelligence would get at. But my point on this example is on the top left quadrant, you have the overview, and it talks about what the program is all about and what it's going to do. On the bottom left quadrant, it talks about the measures of success, risk, and barriers also that this program may encounter. And so this is important because this helps your client realize the importance of the project and also what you see as a potential problem. So think about your needs analysis and what measures of success could be used and what are some risks and some barriers that you foresee in your engagement. So that's important to list out. Is this required for the hat? Absolutely not. But again, I'm just giving you a tool that you can use in real life. This is very useful for executives to see. On the top right quadrant, you have the high level milestones. This is very similar to your timetable, something that you put on your memorandum of agreement. It didn't really look like a timetable per se, but basically you were saying to the client, here, it's going to take me X time to create this, to validate this needs analysis. And so here in this for blocker, you're actually able to pin those dates down based on what you want to accomplish. So if you, for example, want to do an interview and then you want to do a focus group and you want to do a data retrieval, you can set different dates for that. And so that is informing your client as to where you are and what is coming up and when it's going to take place. And then the last quadrant on the bottom right talks about those next steps and what has been accomplished actually. So at the beginning, we can say, I met with the client or I met with the general manager of such and such section, and this is what we found and what needs to happen. Now we need to get that data, we need to codify it, we need to contact an analyst and dump the data into SPSS or into Tableau or statistical software like that, and then run some numbers and so on and so forth. So those next steps help everybody involved in the project know what the direction is coming up. And last but not least, you have the executive summary. So as I was talking about the executive summary, this is a really good example. I extracted it from the web from e-learning, and you have the source there on the screen. You can go check it out. But I really like this particular example. Instead of creating one from scratch, I went ahead and I used this one. So a couple of things. Number one, this executive summary is more for finance. So you will see the financial text in it and words, definitions. But what I really like to go is for the structure. So don't pay attention to the left column. Look at the right column for a moment. The subject matter, that's essentially what your introduction is, what you're going to do the needs analysis about, what your method of analysis is going to be. So that's your methodology, right? You go through it, your question, etc. And then you summarize your findings. You figure out what happened, you do your analysis, etc. And then you conclude, well, because of these findings, this is what I recommend should be the next step, or this is what you should do or shouldn't do, etc. And then of course, after the conclusions, the recommendations, and last, even though this is not required for us, but the limitations of this report. Remember a couple of slides ago when I was saying if you found some barriers and if you found information that wasn't totally clear, it could be detrimental for the future of that project, but it wasn't detrimental for your needs analysis, in which case it's your service to the client where you're saying, hey, by the way, this didn't create a problem for me, or this wasn't a problem related to this needs analysis. However, as an expert, I believe that you should look into this as a future. So that's some limitations. In this particular case, it's talking about the limitations of the report, which you may have some of those, but if you don't, you can simply avoid it and just move forward. So in a nutshell, these are the tools, and this is the way in which you can wrap up your summary. So what I hope is that you guys on the final section of the hat, you summarize your analysis of that data that you collected tell the reader what you found, what the data is telling you, and then you're telling the client what to do with all of that information. So I hope this is helpful and I get to practicing these tools and techniques, and that you guys find the needs analysis entire steps 1, 2, and 3 helpful. Until next time, everyone,